Everyone. This is Container Identity Working Group for July 18, 2018. Today we're going to talk about the AWS pod identity stuff. Who have we got from AWS who's going to talk about that one? Great. Go ahead.
So I thought maybe I could kick it off and then pass it over to a couple other folks. So basically we have one proposal that's been around in the community for some time that was written by some folks over at Uswitch. And then we have another proposal that my colleague Micah is going to speak to, which is a slightly different approach that might be a little bit more long-term. So if someone from Uswitch wants to start out and talk about the KIM proposal, I think that would be a good way to start. And then we can talk about the alternative proposal as well afterwards.
Sure. I'm Tom from Uswitch. I thought I'd jump on to give a bit of context. Sadly, Paul couldn't be here today. So we obviously maintain KIM. One of the themes, I think, at the moment, the sort of four main IAM integrations. And we thought we'd look at what we've learned and what we've seen in the other solutions and to see if we could come up with something that kind of fixed the shortcomings we saw in all of them. We thought, I don't know where it's good to start. We wanted to introduce a few changes to the model that we currently have at the moment. One was switching away from having a metadata proxy running on a machine to sidecars. We wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. One was so that we could use an init container to ensure that credentials were available from the get-go of a workload running. And also to mean that in the future we could support something like Spiffy in order to get better pod identity when communicating to the server, rather than relying on the metadata API. We talked about adding an IAM binding as well, so we could move at the moment binding of pod to IAM role you want is by an annotation. We would like to switch to an IAM binding resource so that we have the flexibility of switching between a couple of different kinds of bindings. So one, maintaining the kind of the service account as a way of doing identity and having permission to access various roles, but also then later down the line opening up support for Spiffy or some kind of pod identity in order to allow access to various different IAM roles to particular pods running in various namespaces. Previously as well, we've been intercepting the EC2 metadata API and intercepting that and replacing the endpoints used for grabbing credentials. We think maybe it would be a better pattern to follow the ECS credential service and switch over to using that. Most of the AWS SDKs seem to offer a kind of retry on that. And we are aware of a case in our proposal where, because of the sort of race condition between the startup of the sidecar, who should be receiving credentials from the init container, and the workload running as well inside the pod, it could be that if say the AWS thing is the first, so getting the credentials is the first thing to happen, that could happen before the sidecar is up and ready to intercept the responses. And by pretending to be the ECS credential service, we will get the benefit of the retries most client libraries already support. So this is it's worth noting that a lot of this proposal is thought of as a bunch of people who are outside of AWS and can't change anything for how it works at the moment. So it's we spoke about, in order to try and get a better bounding from the AWS side in what someone's able to assume in terms of roles. We've spoken about utilizing the sort of role session names and providing a sort of structured name in there that you can then use with conditions in the assume policy in order to limit what's able to access your a particular AWS role from your side. But I can imagine there are much more if we were able to change how like the principles available to us in AWS land, and say you could have like a new EKS kind of set of principles, then you could do something much more powerful there. And then, I mean, lastly, as part of it, we'd have switched to using an admission controller to applying and adding in the init containers and sidecar containers for pods that have been correctly annotated to want IAM resources. I think that gives a little overview. If anyone wants to go to any particular detail on any areas, let me know.
Can you describe how the permission model works? How does a user, an end user, or Kubernetes administrator or operator, how is that operator granted permission to use a role and they create a deployment?
Okay, so in a couple of places, so there's so there we have this IAM binding, which is where you would say this service account has permission to go and try and assume this particular role. So there's we've prefixed in AWS in case this ends up supporting more IAM services than just AWS. But you say AWS, give it a role on, and say give it a service account ref, and you pass the name of the service account you want to give permission to. And then from the AWS side, you then like the server, the IAM sort of server bit will have a role that it will assume that you can give. You can then use in your assume policy for the role that the pod will end up trying to get credentials for. And when the server that role tries to be assumed, it will get passed in the role session name, it will get passed something like the namespace dot the pod name, so that you can then do like a prefix to ensure that inside your the definition of your role, you can say this should be assumable by the Kubernetes, and only things inside of this namespace should be able to do it, or only something with this namespace and this deployment should be able to do it from the AWS side as well as inside the Kubernetes, as well as inside the Kubernetes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then to connect the dot to the end user can create pods in a namespace before they can use service accounts in that namespace. Those service accounts are granted access to roles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Nick Young from Atlassian. I had a question about the init container. Previously, when we've done some stuff around this, the init container, we had some problems because we use pod security policies pretty heavily to sort of strongly restrict the capabilities that that pods can assume. And having the init container an init container running that needs to make IP tables rules means that you need to grant net admin to the whole pod. And we don't want the main application to be able to have net admin. If there's no sub-pod security context yet, then that means you have to grant net admin to the whole pod. That's one of the reasons why when Mikhail built IAM for Q, we're not putting the IP tables part inside the pod, inside the actual pod. Is there any space maybe for making that part of it sort of a little, I don't know, you sort of having some multiple options there about saying, you need to make it so that the metadata rule gets rewritten somehow. But maybe you could do it some other way if you want or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think we basically borrowed from seeing Istio doing that kind of magic, and we were like, oh, that seems like a kind of neat model. But I can understand that net admin for all is not necessarily the best situation. That's interesting to note.
Yeah, just to sort of add on to that, I think our biggest objections to this are just the sort of burden, the infrastructure burden of injecting the init container and the sidecar, and then having to maintain the server, all unnecessary. I mean, all extra infrastructure that the operator would have to maintain.
Yep.
But
I can understand that.
Yeah, like I think I need to be clear though as well. I really like having a binding as a separate object rather than annotation. That's cool.
Yep.
I think that yeah, and the idea of giving of having like giving the roles the sort of the names as far as AWS is concerned to make writing the assume role policy in the target IAM role easier is also a good idea. Yeah. As I said, for us, I think from my experience with doing this, I mean, obviously Jerome wrote Cube to IAM, Mikhail wrote IAM for Cube. We use like crazy extensively. That's why there are 2 solutions from Atlassian already.
Yeah.
Like our biggest problems so far have actually been about the IP tables rules and all of the IP tables rules end up in the right place, and that you don't end up. The other problem that we've had is that with not having a sidecar is that if you set up the IP tables rules to forward the metadata service to a service in cluster, that the nodes that service runs in can't have any other pods that need to talk to that service, because otherwise you end up with an IP tables loop without some IP table shenanigans. That's sort of that's just a little bit more background on why I care so much about it, is because that seems like it to me to be the hardest part.
There's also the case, I don't know, Nick or Micah, if you can talk about like Fargate, the kind of Fargate case where you can't run a daemon set on the node easily.
Nick, do you want to talk about that?
So we haven't done much looking into that because for our use cases we don't use Fargate, so we have full control of the stack and we can run daemon sets on the nodes ourselves. So sorry, I can't help much on that one.
The same for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. We obviously would like to support a model where a nodeless model where we wouldn't be able to do that, and you wouldn't have control over. You'd basically just give the API server a pod spec. The pod spec would be run somewhere, and you wouldn't have the same sort of node, the node object that you have now. Of course, that's not that's future work, and we don't know how exactly that's going to look. So. I don't want to base too much on that, but it is something to take into consideration.
Can you just briefly explain why you prefer the custom resource to the annotation?
I think it's partly just down to flexibility. I'm trying to recall the conversation that we had easily, but being able to support multiple types of identity, and also to be able to potentially support multiple kinds of IAM as well beyond just AWS, were I think some of the motivating factors when we discussed like introducing a binding resource. But also I think matches more closely some other similar kinds of mechanisms that we've seen in the Kubernetes community as well.
I think it's also a little more easy to reason about from an access control standpoint, because you can put RBAC on custom resources. It's very hard to limit what annotations are allowed to go on pods.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I thought was important was that that one of the things that I really liked when Mikhail started talking to me about IAM for Cube was that we migrated the annotation from the pod to the service account. Putting an auth construct on another auth construct seemed to make a lot more sense to me. But the thing I like about the binding is that, as you say, you can put the RBAC on the binding directly, on the binding object directly then, rather than worrying about the annotations. And also I think that having functionality but reliant on a specific annotation like once is kind of my impression from the rest of Kubernetes stuff is that it's about the that's like it's okay for an early implementation, but you should try and sort of move away from using annotations in the longer term, either to a separate object or to to an actual metadata field on an object. I don't think that we're going to get much success with changing the service account or pod or anything like that to have a defined metadata field for like IAM role or something like that. I think having a binding object is going to be easier to do.
Yeah, so I think maybe it would be a good time to sort of just throw in a little bit of discussion about potential another way of going about this. I don't know if Micah, do you want to talk to?
Yeah, so one of the solutions we're exploring right now, and I would say it's like still not quite as developed as the existing solutions, but I think has some benefits over not necessarily needing sidecars or any IP tables changes, and actually almost just very, very little bit of SDK changes. There's the proposal that Mike Denise opened that is about basically making Kubernetes an OIDC provider. The reason why that's really beneficial is in AWS IAM, you can add OIDC providers for federated users. So I've already sort of just prototyped this out by building just the OIDC, just basically taking the proposal, writing a little server that emulates OIDC discovery, and kind of hacking a service account token that might be generated by Kubernetes with all the other OIDC metadata that would be needed in a OIDC token. Basically, this would be the new service account type token, and that could be exchanged. There's already an AWS call, assume role with web identity, where you give an OIDC token to AWS and get back AWS credentials. So the idea being, once Kubernetes is an OIDC provider, you would just need to register that cluster with IAM and exchange your OIDC tokens for IAM role credentials. The benefit about this is that you can, instead of needing to add an annotation to anything or like a CRD, you could just have the SDK use your token and maybe inject a role name via an environment variable or argument or something to assume. And on these IAM roles, you can add as a trust policy the specific subject that you want to be able to assume this role. So instead of saying anyone in this cluster can assume this, any token in this cluster can assume the role, you can scope a role down to a specific service account subject name. Does that make sense?
I think the obvious caveats being that the work for the API server hasn't been done, and still is a proposal. It would need to have an OIDC discovery endpoint. And then also there could potentially need to be SDK changes on the AWS side.
Yeah, and we're still pursuing with our own internal application security to make sure that they're cool with this, just because there's, along with Kubernetes, if you look at the Kubernetes authorization docs, there's a big warning saying about service account tokens. This can lead to blanking out. Privilege escalation by creating a service account that has more permissions than a user. And this could, potentially, if an AWS user was creating a service account token that was greenlit to access a role that had more permission than the user, that's a possibility for privilege escalation. So that's something that we need to...
I think that's generally true about any solution where we're trying to authorize pods to access AWS APIs. Like there's just no solution without some very deep changes to Kubernetes that can scope that down. So it's certainly not unique to OIDC, is I guess what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think that's the case we're going to try to make with our, internal application security, saying this is more like, if you think about it, like a Linux model than an AWS service, where when you launch an EC2 instance, you give it an SSH key, and if someone has access to that SSH key and the role on that instance has more permissions than them, it's the same story. So again, that's not a complete work. The Kubernetes work isn't complete, the AWS work isn't complete, but longer term, that's something that we're very interested in and actively pursuing right now.
And just to reiterate the benefits, I think that obviously there's no init container, no sidecar necessary, no server necessary. The identity starts with the service account and you can limit it on the role based on fields in the job.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions or concerns, comments on that? We'd really like input.
From my point of view, I guess that sounds great. Not needing to run all that stuff in the cluster would be really good. So are you proposing that the API server would provide the OIDC functionality, or would you run something in cluster that would provide the OIDC functionality? I guess is the first question.
Yeah, Mike, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So the Kubernetes issuer is OIDC compliant as far as the ID tokens. The authorization is it doesn't implement any authorization flows. So we kind of, but the authorization is, as far as OAuth goes, is kind of supposed to be pluggable. You can define your own. So we kind of define our own programmatic flow where the kubelet can provision tokens for pods. As far as OIDC discovery, which is a portion of the spec, basically there's two things with an OIDC client, which is in OIDC vernacular, the client is something that validates ID tokens. It's a client of the identity provider. The client needs to discover the two URLs, which is the JSON Web Token URLs to verify the signatures of JOTs, and it needs to discover what audience it should validate against. And if it is able to discover those two things, and it can validate ID tokens, so conceivably you could host an OIDC document off the API server that allows you to discover the keys of the API server. It seems reasonable to bring that functionality into core and just host it off a non-resource URL in the API server. But it's not strictly necessary. I would like to do it.
Yeah, and so in this case, the vernacular, the client would be STS receiving a token, doing the verification against the Kubernetes API server non-resource URL, verifying the signature and the subject and expiration and all that good stuff. Yeah.
Okay, right, but the API server implementation is not required to do this. You could do it with some other service in the meantime. Assuming that service was exposed via an ingress or something like that, and you could
I
get to
don't
it.
know that would work because the issuer depends on, like, if Kubernetes put the issuer as like the cluster, like part of the current proposal is to add an issuer to the token, which is not currently there, and that's required, and that issuer would have to match what STS can access. So I don't know that would be. It might be possible, but it depends on how you'd have Kubernetes configured.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. I just wanted to understand whether the thing was there.
Yeah, this is trying to sort of take advantage of the issuer and audience and structured discovery for verification purposes, portions of OIDC, but is not intending to add like actual token obtaining flows, like where you kick off and do a browser flow or a client authentication flow, or so we're trying to take advantage of the structured bits where it makes sense and try not to do anything too weird, and still say it's OIDC. So that's actually kind of where the discussion's at right now.
And that for us makes a lot of sense, just because it's not a human doing an OAuth flow; it's a machine essentially getting a token and using it for things. So yeah.
I just wanted to interject too and mention that Spiffy is doing some work in this same kind of area around getting JOT versions of Spiffy identities. So I think there's really good alignment here for kind of solving the problem this way.
Yeah, I'm really happy. It sounds really great. The avoiding needing to do all of this sort of funky faking of the metadata service would be really nice.
Yeah. What's the time frame look like for getting Kubernetes as an OIDC identity provider look like?
Probably beta in 1.12 as far as the ID tokens. And if you're willing to host your own discovery doc, that should work. As far as
and that discovery doc is literally just a static document that contains some keys, right?
Exactly. As far as the hosting that off the API server, which is not strictly necessary, I think that we could probably get it in. It depends on priorities leading up to 1.12.
Yeah, and if there's any work that we can do, we'd be happy to contribute to that, because that's obviously important to us. And actually, Mike, I had one question about this, really quick, about that proposal. And I noticed, like, so JWTs have an expiration, but how would say a token was bound to a pod and the token expires before the lifetime of the pod, would there be facility for like token replacement?
Yeah, so the kubelet actually handles refreshing those tokens.
Perfect.
So if you are using the service account token volume projection, you specify a validity duration that you require or want, and kubelet will proactively refresh. I think the logic is either after 24 hours or within 80% of, or within 20% of the total validity duration minus the expiration.
Perfect. No, that's exactly right.
But these are files on disk from the perspective of any pod software, so the SDK will have to know to.
So I was going to ask that, like, what's the, I guess initially here, I'm going to have to modify my application to support this token exchange. Is the long-term plan that this gets baked into the SDKs?
That's what I'm going to push for. Short of that happening, if there's just a flat no, you could obviously modify your application to add your own credential provider for this, or you could run a sidecar that does the same action and hosts it on the ECS URI. But there's no IP tables rewriting necessary, because it would just be localhost to the pod that this sidecar would be listening on.
But does the SDK look at localhost?
It can, yeah. So in the ECS metadata, so there's an ECS relative URI environment variable, but there's also a full URI, and you can change it to whatever you want.
Okay, nice.
And all respect that.
So I will say that initial conversations with the SDK team were a little bit negative towards refreshing, like finding these files on disks and refreshing tokens from them. But if this is the direction that we want to go, I think we could put significant pressure on them to come to a solution that works for us. So we're very optimistic.
And the token itself has the expiration date baked in. So, an SDK loading it can discover when does it expire, and I know when I need to refresh it.
I have one more question.
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
So you would refresh based on the expiration of the HMAC key, right? I guess you would do both. So you would refresh, because you do exchange it for an HMAC key, so you can do V4, right?
Right. Yeah. So like so there's you're right. There's two expirations. So like the HMAC key, if that's shorter than the lifetime of the token, because the token has its own expiration, we just reuse the same token. If it's less, or if the token is shorter than the HMAC key, then the next time we reread from disk.
Right.
Yep.
So conceivably, you could just do it whenever you need to refresh the HMAC key, just read from disk, and you wouldn't even have to
that's totally possible too.
It would be really helpful, and to write all this up in a proposal. I'd be interested to read that. And
yeah, sure. I have an internal document for all this that's more like in Amazon speak, but I'll make it more like readable for public consumption.
Cool, thank you.
So I think two questions. One is, when I get my Kubernetes service account token, my SDK is sort of automatically going to try to assume a federated role. How does it know which federated role to try to assume?
So the argument I'm trying to make is to say you could supply the SDK with a role, like an environment variable for a role name, and say and also a file saying, or an environment variable saying OIDC token file, and that would just be the service account key location.
Cool. My second question is then on the assume role policy on the AWS side, am I going to be able to write that based off of like a namespace or something? Like is a namespace kind of the thing there?
Sure. So that's a good question. The other, from what I've found so far, you can add on the trust relationship, like a string condition to say like only this subject in an OIDC token, which would be in this case this like I think it's like Kubernetes service account namespace token name, or like service account name. I don't think you can right now with STS. You can like add those scope that string equals on any custom metadata like a namespace. I'm going to try to follow up with them to figure out if that's something, because initially I don't think that's something that's supported, but if that's something that we could add for that purpose to say, if there's additional metadata like a namespace, we'd love to just say anything in this namespace, not just this one token, could assume this role.
I think service account name is a good
Sure.
good basic use case. As long as it's like the service account name, not like the token name, right?
That's right. Yeah, because it's the subject in the metadata of the payload. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'd really like to see the non-AWS fee proposal as well.
I'm curious if we use the same ECS environment variable, then we can presumably as well get around any IP tables use in our proposal.
You probably could. There's one. So if you do go down that route, look at the ECS agent code, because they also inject. They don't use a static endpoint. They have a query parameter on the endpoint, because if someone had CAPNet admin, they could potentially get role for a different pod. And so they add this query parameter and inject that in each container to say, to verify basically that you're coming from the right place.
That also, you can also harden against like server-side request forgery that way.
Yep.
That's cool. Yeah, I think we've started the sort of work required in Kayam in order to be able to try out a lot of these ideas we put in the proposal as well. So it's likely we'll go ahead with trying out switching to a sidecar model and playing with some of these ideas at the same time as the OIDC thing. I think that's very exciting. And I think to remove a lot of this operational overhead of provisioning all these little bits of bobs would be amazing.
Yeah, from our point of view, more than likely, I suspect, I didn't know about the way the request URI thing worked, Micah. I suspect we'll probably check for IAM4Kube as well if we can swap some of the stuff we're doing with like IP rewriting for the normal metadata thing to have it use that the ECS style endpoint instead, and see if we can make that work there. It sort of is a shorter term measure before the OAD stuff is ready. You know, we need this like yesterday. So
Yeah. So you'll just look at like the Go SDK is probably the easiest place to find this. There's the full URI and the relative URI, and you'll probably want to look at the full one so that you can do post or something like that.
Yeah, to be honest, I'd actually probably experiment with forwarding it off to the service directly, and yeah, seeing if we could get it to support that API. Cool, thanks.
Cool. I think we're maybe done on that topic. I don't think we have anything else on the agenda, so unless anyone else has something they wanted to cover, we might call it.
Mike added a couple things to the agenda around inline CSI volume plugins.
Yeah, I added 2 items that are just mostly kind of like announcements. So for people who are, if anybody is working on Spiffy in the room, there's a proposal for an inline CSI volume plugin that might be of interest to people. Essentially, that is going to replace flex volumes eventually, and inline means the configuration is specified in the pod spec. So there's some hiccups around like circumnavigating the attach-detach controller for like node local storage that might be of interest. Yeah, so I just wanted to get eyes on that. We don't need to discuss it further. And then the second item that I threw on, the last item I threw on, was around limiting audience of the OIDC issuer. So I actually had one of my coworkers named Breno review our ID token flows, and he actually is one of the authors of the OIDC spec, so he's pretty knowledgeable on the stuff, and he pointed out that there's 2 configurations that need to be discovered during OIDC discovery, which are the Jukes URLs and the audience that the client should identify itself as. And while the OIDC document offers a URL to the Jukes URL, we don't have actually a good story around discovering what audience a client should identify as. So a couple of things that he proposed were potentially using, for in-cluster clients, using the service account that the client is running as, and then obviously we would support externally bound audiences. So I guess the problem that we would try to guard against here is to prevent people from misconfiguring OIDC clients. It's a kind of a difficult problem. And something that we have had varying luck with is to limit what can actually be specified in the audience. So for a while, for the OIDC issuers for GC EVMs, we supported specifying either OAuth client IDs or external URLs, and just calling it there and not specifying anything in between. So I guess the equivalent would be in Kubernetes to either validate that audience is a service account name or a external URL with like maybe scheme HTTPS with an authority. So and not right now. The current situation is that it's just a free-form string. So I think that I'm going to try to write up some of the problem statement, and we can start to brainstorm potential avenues to make the situation better. Does anybody have any thoughts on that off the cuff?
What is STS expecting for the audience?
STS, when you configure the OIDC provider, you just specify what audience you're looking for.
Okay.
So, like for my sort of dummy test, I just put in this text string public, and in my JWTs put in public, and since STS just saw that there was a match, it worked. So when you configure STS, you just drop in whatever you want.
Yeah, so you bring up an issue with the proposed solution, which is like sometimes maybe like Pinterest requires a random generated string with exclamation marks and ones and zeros, and those don't fit nicely into a URL. So that's the problem with tightening those or making the audience more restricted. So yeah, I think a survey of what people expect would be required before restricting that field.
Does the spec require that to be an accessible URL, or is that just text strings that it requires?
I think it can be basically anything.
Okay.
And what's the rationale behind trying to make it a URL? Do we think that clients will do some special processing if it is a URL, or?
So I think that the misconfiguration that Mike's talking about is if I have a multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster, I have different admins who each independently set up two different roles, federated roles. They happen to use the same audience for both of them.
Oh, okay.
Then one of them can assume the other one's role, and they really shouldn't be able to because the signing keys are the same for both.
Right. Okay.
Or even two instances of the same component deployed in independent namespaces that hard-coded their expected audience to my component and never considered that they might have two instances of it.
I have one other concern I'd just like to discuss. So if we add a OIDC discovery endpoint that's either served out of the API server or is served by what other component in the cluster, that needs to be publicly accessible over HTTPS with like Internet PKI certs. That feels like relatively reasonable to me, that if you need to use this feature, that's the bar to entry. I also want to make sure that like we are leaving the door open to rotate the JWT signing keys, because that's not automated right now in Kubernetes, but I think that would be a useful thing to do in the future. And that makes sure that needs to be taken into account. If we're talking about, hey, I'm going to copy paste some discovery information into STS, and then that's going to break if my signing key rotates every week or something.
Yeah, that's been something we've talked about for private clusters, and the easy solution is host it in a Lambda, right? Like the discovery portion, and make that public and leave the cluster private. And I think as far as key rotation, like you're completely right. Like that's something that we would want. It's something that's critical enough that I don't know if that's something that should be in the cluster. I mean, I'm very open to correction on this, but I don't know if like API server should be responsible for generating and storing those keys in etcd. You wouldn't want them, I don't think, you wouldn't want them as Kubernetes objects, but like that seems to me like it should be an out of band process.
Yeah, and it is on some implementations. Like I believe somebody can correct me, but on GKE, the signing infrastructure is totally separate from the API server.
Yeah, we struggle, as far as Kubernetes open source, we struggle with towing the line between the Unix philosophy, where everything should be purpose built and do one thing really well, versus something that is reasonably possible to deploy for the layman operator. That's often difficult.
And so going along those lines of like key rotation, since they're JWTs, they're not really, I guess, revocable. So the way to revoke would just be to rotate out the keys. Is that right? I'm just confirming that's sort of the assumption here.
The token review offers possibility for revocation of those tokens, but an OIDC client would not be using the token review. So
yeah, so you'd have to rotate the key that signed a compromised token out to effectively revoke it.
Yeah, it's pretty harsh.
All right. Anything else people wanted to cover?
Just a generic comment. What other proposals other than the AWS IAM proposal we were just discussing are floating out for container identity? Can someone post that on the Slack? And is SIGAUTH the right channel for container identity?
Yeah, SIGAUTH is a good channel for container identity. We've had a few proposals that you can probably dig through the channel to find. As we've had some demos, but as far as I can tell, everybody's in pretty early stage.
Sounds good. So where can I find those proposals?
What are you looking for specifically? For other
No, just
providers, or
no, just I thought the group started with the generic, like, what does container identity mean? So I was looking for something like that.
Yeah. So if you, I think it's, I'll find it in the documentation and post a link to it. There was some early docs about kind of where we want to go with identity and where we should kind of attach identities and that kind of stuff. I can post some of those early docs in this week's notes. You can probably also find them on the container identity mailing list. And I think the charter, the initial charter maybe has a link to those as well too, but I'll post them in the in today's notes.
And,
Cool,
and
thanks,
the, agenda,
Greg. Yeah.
the agenda doc has, if you look through the notes back to the old meetings, there are a lot of pointers out to the various things that have been proposed and discussed. So those three are good sources.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'll take a look.
I had a question too, just about timing of this meeting. Is this a firm 10 Pacific time biweekly, or is there's a number of, there's a weekly Amazon meeting that basically all the SDMs are involved in during this period, and the STS IAM folks and our leadership too would like to be involved in this discussion, but are otherwise tied up. So I didn't know if there's any opportunity for alternate time, but
we literally just moved it.
okay, sorry.
So like
I'm late to the game.
So yeah, it took us probably about 2 months to figure out a time, and probably like you can look at the history, but yeah, we moved it probably like, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago or something. So I don't really want to start that process again.
Bring that up.
But
democratic.
yeah, yeah, it's hard to get this many people to agree to a time. But we do want your involvement, so I don't know. Maybe we can figure something out in the future. But I'm a little burnt out on reorganizing this meeting.
Totally understand.
Yeah.
Hi Nadir, just on a small admin point, if you could get this meeting into the community events calendar, so I don't think it's there at the moment.
That would be great.
Yeah, and I think
someone could do that. Yeah.
The community page still shows the Tuesday time.